They posted the photos at dawn, and by 9 the whole town had scrolled through the version of her someone else wanted the world to see. On screen, people typed verdicts like sentences short, sharp, and cruel. Someone in the comments called her an embarrassment. Another suggested she had ruined a family's name. The images were ordinary enough on their own. A dim hotel lobby, a hand brushing against an arm, laughter caught in the wrong frame. Alone, none of them would have meant much. Strung together and captioned, they became a story, Stella Bell. Once quiet, once nearly invisible, now the center of a rumor that would not let her go. Stella stared at the phone on the counter of the diner where she worked, at the tiny red badge that pulsed over the screen messages, mentions. Snapshots of an evening she barely remembered, all rearranged until they blamed her. Her knuckles were white around the ceramic mug she had been wiping. She kept that gesture so the world could see she was holding on to something steady. Inside, everything slid. Hermanagé? A woman named Marcy, with a clipped bun and a tolerance for crisis that had earned her the last 5 owners' trust, watched the way Stella swallowed the words left unsaid. "You all right?" she asked, voice soft but not prying. The lunch rush hummed like a distant machine. Plates clinked. Someone drew Stella no dead. "I'm fine." That became the story, she told everyone. Fine, fine, fine. At home that night, Pearl Stella's grandmother met her at the threshold with an apron dusted in flour and a look that said the apron was more than habit. It was history. Pearl had raised Stella on rye and patience. She had known hunger in the way it hollowed a person out, then filled them back up with hands and heat. She did not look at the phone. She set a loaf of yesterday's bread on the table and simply said, "Tell me what happened." Stella tried to speak. The rumor had a sound to it, a chorus of townspeople leaning together to shout without hearing. When she finally told Pearl the half-remembered Story-Ann office party. A few glasses of wine, a late elevator ride. Pearl's face did not tighten with disbelief. It tightened with the same old calculation she used when the flour ran low and the bills piled up. "We'll keep the bakery move warm," Pearl said. "You'll sleep here tonight." Outside, Stella heard footsteps on gravel. She pretended not to, but the knock on the door made both of them look. Ruby had arrived with the kind of timing that always belonged to people who were certain their entrance would be noticed. Ruby, Pearl's step-granddaughter, by way of a marriage that had never knitted its edges, smoothed her dress as though she was a permanent headline. "Everyone's saying you did it on purpose," Ruby said casually, like sharing a weather report. Her voice had a polished edge crafted at some private school that never taught humility. She lifted a phone and scrolled for effect. "People say you wanted the attention. People say you'd do anything." Stella's face went hot. "That's not true," she said, because protestations had become muscle memory. Her voice sounded smaller in the doorway than it had in the diner. "You should have thought of that before," Ruby said, almost disappointed. "I mean, do you realize how this looks for the family? Father is getting calls. Libby is furious. You can't keep embarrassing us." The word family landed like a hand on Stella's shoulder, the kind that presses and then leaves a bruise. Stella had never been good at performing the right sort of pedigree. The Fords, her father's new line of in-laws, carried their lineage like suitcases stamped with a crest. Stella carried flour on her sleeves. With each barb Ruby delivered, the room inside Stella narrowed. Pearl stepped in between them, slow but direct. "Ruby," she said, "you can leave now." Her tone was the sort that had kicked men out of the bakery for swearing at the loaves. Ruby smiled with a small, sharp smile. "Fine, but just so, Fatis is thinking about coming here tomorrow to have a talk." Stella had always known that talk would take place one day, an inspection of every choice she had ever made. Tonight it felt less like an inspection and more like an autopsy. She watched Ruby go, watched the car lights bleed into the evening, and when the door closed, she slid to the kitchen chair and let the panic rise up like heat. The next morning the manager at the diner called. "We have to let you go," Marcy said, and the word release thudded through the thin line of the phone. "We can't be associated with a scandal. The regulars are. Well, they already took sides." Stella hung up with shaking hands. The town was small enough that every headline landed on someone's porch. Her name was the latest pebble, and the ripples were reaching the bank, her landlord, the people who held her future in small, polite hands. That was where Ethan came in. He did not show up in a suit the first time she met him. He appeared at the diner with a coffee cup and an interview-slim smile, a man who could have been anyone passing through. He sat at the corner booth as if he were waiting for a story to unfold and not, in fact, orchestrating a part of it. Stella noticed, because people are never as careful as they think. He was patient without being obvious, and his eyes returned to her when the lunch rush thinned. He left a note with his number and a quiet sentence. "If you need anything, call." She did not call that day. She called 3 nights later, when the landlord came by and said he'd need rent by the week, sans dorels. She told the barest facts to the voice on the phone, and a minute after she hung up there was a knock on Pearl's door. Ethan stood there, not as a stranger this time, but like an imprint from a book cover. Clean lines, courteous voice. He had an air to him, none of it showy, but it was the sort of air that made people assume he had options. Pearl poured cocoa and asked him how he liked it, as if this were a test he would pass by simply drinking. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, after she had told him the headlines and the landlord and the hunger. He looked at Stella with an expression she could not name, a tilt that suggested he believed partly what he hoped. "But there are practical things we can do." The plan was quiet in the beginning, funds to tide them over. A call to the landlord, a polite message to the diner's owner in question form that discouraged rash firings. He insisted on buying a modest security system for Pearl's house, on setting up a small account that would cover Stella's rent for a month that month, that would be a bridge. It was swift, methodical kindness. It also raised questions. Why would a man she barely knew do this? There was something almost reckless in the way he slid a card across the kitchen table and said, "Do what you need. I can help more than that, if you want." Stella, who had never wanted to be helped by strangers in a way that cost dignity, hesitated. "Why?" she asked finally. The question had aches inside it, mistrust, the knowledge that favors always come with a price. Ethan's answer was a shrug. "No one deserves that, assez simple. People deserve their name tag to be believed until proven otherwise." It was not an answer that cleared everything. It was, however, an answer that made her think of the bakery she had been saving for, of Pearl's hands that had never stopped shaping loaves as if kneading life back into stubborn dough. It made her think of a safe place where people were known for what they made, not for what they'd been accused of. When the tabloids grew louder, when a local blogger dug for salacious angles, and one of Stella's old classmates sent a screenshot of a whisper. Group with cruel captions, the pressure bent toward the obvious, either go away or fight back. Neither route offered safety. The rumor was greedy, it ate options. Ethan proposed a third thing. "Marry me," he said once. In the lobby of the courthouse, where there was a woman behind the counter whose job was to fill out forms for people whose lives had become messier than they anticipated. The words fell between them like a careful object placed on a table. It will shut down the tabloids for a minute. It will give you legal rights, someone to speak for you officially. I don't think marriage should ever be trivialized, but there are times when a promise can be practical. Stella could feel the world tilt. "That's not an answer," she said. "You want to marry me because it's useful." He looked at her. "I want to protect you. I don't believe the story. I don't think you deserve to have your life turned into someone's content." He hesitated, then added, "I'll do more than speak. I'll help you rebuild." They married 2 weeks later, not with fanfare, but with a clerk and a witness. With Pearl in an apron and Marcy in a good coat, and a thin slice of small-town curiosity pressed against the windows of the municipal building. There were photographs, but not the kind that would sell. There were 2 signatures on a form that made something official in the eyes of the town. Stella felt like a character in someone else's tidy narrative. For the public, it silenced the last rumor slightly. It offered a neat headline someone could run with, "Local woman Mary's protector for Stella." It was a decision braided of survival and mistrust. She would not call it love. Not yet. It did, however, create space. He bought the small tear-down bakery. On the corner of their street, an old place with windows rimed in paint, and a back room that smelled like yeast and lost dreams. The sign said Bell & Co. In a hand-lettered font Pearl insisted on. Ethan signed the paperwork himself and paid for renovations that made the place look like hope dressed in fresh paint. "You don't have to do this," Stella said the day the keys were handed over. The sun laid itself over the counters like a benediction. There were sacks of flour stacked in the corner in neat tiers, and a chalkboard that read "Opening soon." Ethan's fingers brushed hers as he took the keys. "I want to," he said. "You'll keep the name." There was the hint of a smile that might have been sincerity. "You keep the taste." Working in the bakery was a slow kind of healing. Stella learned to coax a crust to a golden patience. She burned the first few loaves and laughed with Pearl at the charred edges. Customers came with cautious curiosity and left with warmth in their hands and soft apologies on their lips. The everyday gestures needing, folding, opening the oven slowly, knit Stella's hands into her own story. She was no longer only the woman in a scandal. She was someone tending heat and sugar and customers who loved their cinnamon rolls. Ethan was there in a way that startled her. He'd show up before dawn, sleeves rolled up, paying attention to how she mixed the batter, asking with surprise when she corrected him. He was not a man of idle words. He would lift a hand to cover a sprinkle of sugar meant for the top of a tart, and his touch was a gentleness she had not expected. He defended her in small ways that mattered. Once when a delivery driver made a joke about the town gossip. Ethan's hand on the man's shoulder was a restraint that spoke louder than any argument. He insisted on a notice at the counter that offered us civility. "We are a place for good bread." The line was small, but it stopped some of the harsher stares. And yet, There was a secret tucked like a coin in his pocket. He smiled as if he were content in a quiet life, but sometimes when the phone rang he would answer with a tone that belonged to a man whose world ran deeper currents. He would close a door to take a call and speak in a language of meetings and stock options that Stella learned to tune out. One autumn night she followed a thread and discovered a photo of him in a suit, at a corporate podium, smiling under a banner of a company she did not know. Someone had posted it as if it were ordinary just another man at work. But the comments beneath it called him the CEO. She confronted him gently, handing him the printout of his face in a tie. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan's shoulders drooped, with the weight of something he confessed only with his eyes. "I wanted to see who you are without what I have," he said. "I wanted it to be about you." "For yourself," she said, because that was the smallest cruelty that truth could fold into. You wanted to be the correct kind of mystery. He reached for her hand. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. "I was trying to protect you from people who would make things worse because of me." She heard charity in his voice. She also felt the rub of betrayal. Marriage had promised safety, a shelter. The omission read like a locked door between them. "You need to understand," she said, "that some of us build on the truth we have. Lies, even small ones, shift everything." He nodded, guilty and honest. "I know. I'm sorry." Apology arrived in actions. He put his name on the old bakery's legal sign. He wired a fund for emergency repairs. He stood up in the middle of a town meeting to call out a rumor mill and demand decency. He hired a young woman, Katie, who used to work as a barista and had a 3-megapixel blog that suddenly converted into a megaphone. Katie started posting about Stella's pastry classes and the grandmother who taught the town how to make a proper rye. John Wilther, assistant, who looked like he carried the weight of 1,000 late-night fixings quietly, began to look into the source of the photos. But the town does not get in the habit of swallowing pride so quickly. For every neighbor who popped in for a roll and said, "We're behind you," there was at least one person who still preferred the sharp taste of scandal. Ruby did not relent. She began attending the town board meetings with a notebook and questions that sounded innocent until she chose to press. "How long did you know he had money?" She asked loud enough to be overheard. "Why did you change your name? Do you think marriage buys forgiveness?" Family dinners became interrogations in polite clothes. Libby, the Ford's matriarch, pressed at Stella with the sort of concern that belonged in a small courtroom. "You married too fast," she said. "You've tied yourself to a man who could have used his influence to do all of this and yet chose. What exactly?" As a bakery, even the oven seemed to take a side in what felt like a courtroom drama. Customers came with warmth and left with a sliver of gossip. The town still whispered. Ruby's whispers turned into acts that tasted of quiet malice. A health inspector's surprise visit led to an unsealed return form that claimed improper storage. A delivery was late and a sack of flour sat dump in the alley, ruined. Someone squealed to a local blog that the bakery was trying to hide something. Stella began to understand how small cruelty accumulates into catastrophe. Each tiny sabotage had a weight. Each rumor became another brick. She and Pearl worked through those bricks daily, trying to keep the oven hot and the signs of fault at bay. Customers who mattered returned, but it felt like a fragile thing easily knocked by a headline or a text message. Ethan fought back. He would call the diner owner to insist his new wife had always been reliable, he would sit in meetings and say, "This is nonsense," and John would, almost silently, start to assemble a paper trail. They tracked the origin of photos to a server in town and the names that pinged it. They found a cluster of messages that read like coordination rather than coincidence. Katie turned her blog into a ledger of small kindnesses and receipts that contradicted the dark picture people had painted. "And yet," Stella said one evening, standing at the back table where Pearl stacked crumbled tins and Katie scribbled social media replies, "It's like fighting fog." "You're not fighting it alone," Katie said, fierce in a way that felt brand new. "We have memos. We have logs. People saw what happened that night. Someone put something on the internet to make a story. We can show that the story was stitched." Stella wanted to believe them. She wanted to lean into the ordinary, to let the dough take the shape of her life once more. There were moments tender, unlike the rest when Ethan would bring tea and sit at the counter, and they would talk about nothing of consequence. He would tell her about places he travelled for work, about a small island where he liked the light at dawn. She would teach him how to measure yeast by feel. Those minutes were quiet patches in the wider storm. They felt like currency. Still, the omission about his life sat like a stone between them. He had not lied by saying he was poor. He had not invented a need. He had merely chosen to show her a life without the scaffolding of his status. To him, it was an experiment in sincerity. To her, a safety net had been withheld. Ruby smelled weakness and pressed in. Late one night, after the bakery had closed and the oven had cooled and Pearl was asleep with a shawl across her knees, Stella found an envelope shoved under the door. Inside was a single photograph of her at a hotel, cropped and captioned with an accusation. The photo was not new, and yet it arrived with the precise cruelty of proof. The caption below it suggested impropriety and connection, a man's silhouette, a smudge that could be anyone's hand. Stella crumpled the photo in her fist until the paper bit her skin. She had not imagined this would be easy. She had imagined struggle, but not the relentless, petty creativity of those who wanted to humiliate. Pearl found her in the morning, the photograph smoothed out on the counter like a landmine. "We will find out who put that there," she said. Her voice was steady. Tuxedois included the smallest of towns, and the town's collective eye was sharp. John will call that afternoon with a single line, "We've got something." His tone was low and careful. He had been tracing IP addresses, receipts, security logs from the hotel where the photos had originated. "There's a pattern," he said. Someone accessed the security feed and saved the footage. The timestamps don't match the narrative people pushed. Can you get them? Katie asked, already thinking of headlines that could undo the damage. John inhaled. Maybe. It's messy. But there's a backup on the cloud that hasn't been overwritten. We can file for access. We can get a subpoena. He sounded both triumphant and exhausted. The legal machinery hummed slow and hungry, but it was a machine that could be coaxed into motion. When Stella heard that, hope rose like a warm oven. Maybe truth had a way of seeping back into the cracks. Maybe the town's cruelty could be pinned down and exposed. And yet, before the legal avenue could reach its teeth into the problem, another crack opened. One morning, a headline rolled across a local feed, Au Secret Breed. It was a piece of a larger article about a company whose CEO had quietly married a local woman. The tone implied scandal in a different direction. The town's narrative shifted from shame against Stella to a suspicion about Ethan. Comments bloomed like mold. Some celebrated. Others felt betrayed on behalf of Stella, as if his concealment made him complicit in the original rumor. Stella read the headline with trembling hands. The world was suddenly not about the original accusation, but about the new omission. His choice to hide being a CEO now read like a deception that could be used as fuel for gossip until it burned everything dry. She walked to the bakery as if the floor needed to be tested for cracks. Pearl was there, dough under her nails, and Katie sat at the small table, phone propped, fingers moving. They looked up as Stella came in and did not ask what had happened. Instead, they made room. Ethan was at the back, opening a box of new labels that would soon read Bell & Co., his sleeves rolled up in the way he had learned to do since he started showing up. He looked older than he had a week ago. The lines around his eyes, pronounced in a way that said worry, had taken residence. When Stella stood in the doorway, he came to meet her without the practiced smile that usually read the room. He had none to offer now. "You saw it," he said, but it was not a question. "Did you think hiding would save me?" Her voice was low, the kind that does not demand an answer, but gives it its own shape. He closed the distance between them and took her hands, fingers roughened by the last hour's work. "I wanted you to be loved for you, not who I am," he said again like a mantra. "I wanted to keep you separate from my world." "You kept me a secret," she said. "That's what it felt like. I thought I married someone who would be honest with me." Ethan's mouth quirked. "I was honest about the important parts," he swallowed. "I shouldn't have kept that from you." Stella let out a breath that might have been a laugh, then a sob. It swelled with all the small betrayals of their months together, the quiet lies that accumulate like dust. The bakery hummed around them, the sorter's rustle, the bell over the door where a regular came in for a bagel and gave them both a small, encouraging nod. "You should have told me," she said simply. "I know." He pulled her toward the back room where the workbench had maps of dough recipes and sticky notes for suppliers. The workbench was neither court nor confession, it was practical. "I'll tell you everything," he promised. "But I need you to know why I did it. I didn't want your life to be easier because it was mine. You made it harder," she said. "Every omission shifts the ground." He winced, as if each word she spoke could be a grate on his conscience. "Then tell me what to do," he said. "I will fix it." "I will. You can't fix everything with money," she cut in. The words were sharp but true. "You can't buy me back the things people said." His jaw tightened. "Then I'll fight." He sounded like someone who had been trained to marshal armies of emails and executives. "I'll get John to pull the hotel footage. I'll make a statement. I'll go to your family and tell them the truth about what happened." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that his being CEO meant he had tools she could not see, contacts, leverage, the kind of reach that could make lies stop. She also knew that power moved in mysterious ways. It could build bridges or burn cities. A text arrived on her phone. It was from an unknown number. The message contained a single line: "You don't belong here." The bitter sweet of the bakery's heat felt like an old home in which strangers left marks. Stella folded the phone into her pocket and kept her face neutral. Pearl squeezed her hand, and the bakery carried on. Later that night, Marcy called to say someone had posted a review claiming they had been sick after visiting Bell and Co. The comment had been anonymous. The oven, once a celebration of daily rituals, now had to be defended against the most intimate weapon the town had, accusation. John Will's voice over the next call was rapid and careful. "We found access logs," he said. "There are fingerprints, digital ones. Someone spoofed an IP and pulled footage. It looks deliberate. Can we pin it?" Katie asked, hungry for the truth to be held in hands. "Maybe it's messy. But there's enough to start a legal request. We can get a temporary restraining order on the footage release. It might not stop people from talking, but it gives us a paper trail." Ethan listened to John and then looked at Stella, the two of them standing between ovens and pastry racks like to halves of a promise. He held out a plan that smelled of corporate meetings and long nights, statements, lawyers, carefully worded denials, a path toward clearing her name. Stella wanted to believe in the plan's geometry. She wanted to allow it to be a rope back to some shore. And yet, when she looked at Ethan, she saw how the same hands that could cut a check also had learned slowly to knead dough. She saw the contradiction and felt it acutely. A man who could rewrite a company's fiscal quarter was also the person who had begun to learn the grammar of her life. "Do it," she said finally. "But don't make it all about you." His eyes blue and tired lifted. "I won't." They moved forward in a cadence that felt like walking over stepping stones laid in haste. The bakery reopened with a small sign that read, "We're here, we're honest, we're open." People came. Some left with sympathy and crumbs, some left with a sharper look. Ruby's barbs did not stop. If anything, she widened the attack, moving from whispers to a plan that smelled of desperation, anonymous tips to the local health board, false leads to the press. One morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the bakery's address. It was addressed to Stella in a hand she did not recognize. Inside was a short, clipped note. "You can undo this if you end it now." The rest was empty space and threat. Ethan's reaction was a small, controlled storm. He called contacts, demanded investigation, promised legal action. His assistant, John, dug deeper into the network that had smeared her. He found among servers and anonymized accounts a pattern that suggested coordination rather than random cruelty. The threads led, intriguingly, to people connected to the Ford family and, in particular, to a small, shadowy cluster of accounts that had one person's signature style, Ruby's. But proof was not the same as verdict. It would time suppuena fil testimony. It would take money and patience and the kind of labor that moves like winter, unseen, cold hard, necessary. Stella felt herself split between fury and relief. The fury burned clean, for the photos, for the envelope, for every question that had been asked as if she were on trial. The relief was a complicated thing. At least someone moved. That someone happened to be a man whose life was partly shrouded from her. That someone was sometimes clumsy in his restitution and often bureaucratic in his love. At the end of a day, when she had overbaked a tray and laughed at the burnt corners with Pearl until her sides ached, Stella stood on the bakery's small back stoop and watched the street. The light washed over the old sign and made the letters glow. A couple with a stroller passed. A man waving to coffee, cups drifted by and called a hello. The town had a way of returning, slowly, to its routines. She had hoped, once, that marriage would be a place of safety where lives were mended quietly over dishes and years. Instead, she had married into a different kind of repair project, a public, almost performative saving. There were moments now when she could not tell if she was being repaired or being used as an instrument in someone else's redemption. When Ethan slipped out of the back room to meet with a reporter who lived 2 towns over, Stella could not help but overhear a snippet he left behind. "I don't want this to be about me," he said into the phone. "I want it to be about the truth." He ended the call and found Stella looking at him. "You didn't want to marry a symbol," she said, "not a question." "No," he answered. "Just a person." The words felt vulnerable and true and still insufficient. Danaid. When the bakery was shut and Pearl slept with one light on so she could read the newspaper without missing the world, Stella checked her phone for messages from John. There was a single line, "We might have something that will change everything." She stared at the words until their edges blurred. Change sounded like a possibility and also like a threat. It could topple the town's narrative against her and fling it wide open, showing the manipulation, exposing the cruelty. Or it could shift attention to Ethan and the ways he had hidden his life, offering new angles for people to chew on. Either way, she knew now that truth, once unleashed, was not a simple balm. It could be a blade. She picked up a small photograph. She had kept one of the earliest loaves she had made by herself, with a cracked crust and a proud shape. She put it in her apron pocket and went to bed with the weight of tomorrow pressing like a hand at the base of her skull. Outside, the town slept in snippets between streetlights. Inside their small kitchen, Pearl folded her hands. And for the first time in a long time, Stella listened to an older woman who had been through storms and still pulled bread from the ashes. "Don't let them make you small for their comfort," Pearl said in the quiet. "You have hands that shape things. Let them be shaped by you, not by what they think you owe them." Stella closed her eyes and let the sentence sink in like yeast. She did not know how to answer that night. She only knew that the next morning would hold a lawyer's signature, a subpoena, and perhaps a video that could prove what they said it would prove. She also knew that Ruby was not done. Petty cruelty becomes an industry when people are desperate to cling to the past. The phone buzzed again at dawn. This time the caller ID read John Will. His voice on the line was both sharp and oddly tender. "We pulled the backup," he said. "But we're not the only ones who pulled it. Someone else tried to overwrite it." Stella's stomach dropped. "Did you stop them?" "We made a copy," John said. "It's safe, for now. But listen, what's on it isn't just what people think. It changes the story." She felt the line between hate and love in that moment like a pulled thread. The town had been quick to hate her for what they thought they saw. Ethan had intervened and, with his money and his public claims, he had changed the arc of her life in ways no one could yet name. But the truth, messy, stubborn, capable of liberation, was waiting to be revealed on a screen. It would not be neat or immediate. It would demand that people look and then look again. Ethan arrived at the bakery with a quiet resolve. He went to the back room, pulled the curtains closed, and sat at the small table with Stella. John would be delivering the files to their lawyer within the hour. "If this proves what we hope," Ethan said, thumb tracing the rim of his mug, "then it clears you. It clears your name. It punishes the people who orchestrated this. What if it clears me, but exposes everything about you?" "Sure, ask." It was a question she'd been turning over in her mind like a coin. What if it looks like you used me or hid me so your image was neat? Ethan's breath stuttered. He did not have an answer that fit the neatness she wanted. I will face it, he said. I will face whatever comes. They sat with that. Outside, the street held people on their way to jobs, to errands, to lives that would be touched by their day but not defined by it. They were a small family of misfits trying to repair a life that had been made public in the roughest possible way. The bakery hummed slowly, its ovens waiting like patient sentinels. There was an electricity in the air that smelled faintly of sugar and fear. When John came in with the legal pad and the after-hours coffee, his face was a map of concentration and something like relief. We've got the copy, he said. The footage is intact. It shows who accessed the feed. It's not perfect, but it shows enough to go to the authorities. And there's something else Anne exchanged that suggests coordination. Cathy, who had not stopped tweeting supportive threads and uploading videos of customers praising Stella's cinnamon rolls, grinned like someone who found a secret and wanted to share it. This is the moment, she said. Stella wanted so badly to let herself believe. There was a line in her chest that slid between cautious joy and the knowledge that victory does not happen without cost. John's eyes found Ethan's and lingered. We'll move carefully, he said. We'll file. We'll request custody of the footage. We'll do it the right way. Do it now? Ruby's voice said in Stella's ear like a phantom, the thought of it the aftertaste of a meal. The town and its hunger had a way of pushing people into decisions. Ethan stood and put a hand over Stella. Ethan stood and put a hand over Stella's in a way that was both an anchor and an apology. The small table between them held a list of next steps in a handwriting that had suddenly become urgent. Subpoena, press statement, witness list, timeline. John had folded the printed copy and set it beside a thermos of lukewarm coffee like a talisman. We move as carefully as we can, Ethan said. His voice had the flat calm of someone used to making decisions that affected many people. And yet now it trembled in a way that betrayed how much this particular decision mattered to him. Stella looked at the plans and then at him. There was effort in each muscle of her, face the kind that keeps a person steady while their inside brightens and darkens in rapid swings. Do what you need, she said. But if this blows up everything about your life, I need you to understand I won't be collateral. He nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. I know. He met her eyes. I will stand in front of whatever comes. I'll accept consequences, but I refuse to let them hurt you any more. John called in the afternoon, voice clipped with progress. We served the subpoena. The hotel's cloud backup is secure for now. The police will want to see the copy. We have signatures from staff members corroborating that footage was accessed oddly. There's enough to open an investigation. Also, he hesitated, then added, we pulled security camera logs from the town's municipal servers. There's a pattern of logins from an IP range linked to someone who's been unusually interested in the Ford family's affairs. Ruby's name hovered in the air like a thin fog no one wanted to inhale. It had been their suspicion. The network of anonymous accounts, a string of threatening messages. The targeted post someone had stitched a story and fed it to a town that loved a drama. Now they had threads they could tug on. The legal work moved with a bureaucratic gravity that felt both slow and unstoppable, papers crossed hands. Phone calls were transcribed into meeting notes. Ethans whirled the boardrooms, the legal teams. The steady calendar of decisions lent muscle to the otherwise fragile architecture of Stella's defense. He was not merely spending money. He was opening doors, lawyers who could file quickly, PR people who could navigate the old rules of the town paper, and contacts who could confirm what John had found. For the first time since the photos had gone live, Stella saw the machinery of truth moving with a certainty that didn't belong to gossip. But the town's appetite for scandal could not be turned off overnight. The health complaints continued to be a drip under the door, anonymous comments. Wisecracks exchanged over coffee, a legislative-minded neighbor fanning conversation into suspicion. Ruby, sensing the risk of being exposed, shifted from whispers to a bolder posture. She began to show up at community events with a notebook and a smile that cut like a scalpel. When she was asked a question she could not answer, she offered insinuations instead of fog of suggestion that left minds to fill in the blanks. Then, on a chilled Thursday, the press came. A reporter from the county paper who had once written fluff pieces sat in the back of the bakery with an earnest look and a pen at the ready. Ethan had given them a statement. "We are cooperating with authorities. We are committed to the truth." He had not asked for more. His restraint in front of the cameras was intentional. They both needed the legal process to unfold without the reckless wind of public spectacle. When the police finally took the copied footage into custody, John breathed a little easier. "This should do it," he said. The timestamps show clear access and a download history. Whoever did this tried to disguise it, but they missed a pattern. A login came from a device that pinged a router associated with a house the Fords use. Stella's stomach lurched. She thought of family dinners that had become interrogations, of Libby's thinly veiled contempt, the idea that someone she was supposed to be related to by law, by name, by marriage of the past might be, behind it felt like betrayal cut in half. The day the detective visited the bakery, he was careful and professional. He asked for statements. He asked for playlists of activity for the night in question, names of people who were there. Anything that might triangulate who had benefited from the smear. Ruby had been circumspect in her replies, a portrait of concern and convenience. But the online footprints were messy for those who thought they could control them. The detective had found a trail, a borrowed laptop, a library network card used in a hurry, and a forwarding address that looped back to someone who received mail at the Ford estate. "You're not alone in this," the detective said gently to Stella when the questions had been answered. "We've seen people try to weaponize reputations before. This isn't your fault." It was a sentence that landed like a kind of relief inside something that had been hollowed out for months. She breathed as if she had been underwater and had only now found a place to break the surface. The legal pressure mounted. Subpoenas arrived at the Ford house like shells. Libby's pride flared, but her defenses were brittle. Ruby, whose attacks had been sharp and personal in public, began to show the tremor in private. She reached out to a cousin who worked in administration at the town library and asked for access to something she'd had no right to request. The cousin, who had always thought of Ruby as a harmless gossip queen, found herself entangled in a web that felt suddenly heavy with consequence. She told the detective everything she knew, which was not much more than a trail of nervous messages and a borrowed device. When the police moved in for interviews, the town watched with the unique hunger small communities possess for theatre. People leaned from porches and pretended not to look. Katie live-streamed a piece of the waiting line at the courthouse, the caption gentle, not salacious, justice, maybe, this time. Her followers left messages of support, love, bread, solidarity. The town's attention split into two streams: those who felt vindicated and those who recoiled at the thought of public shame landing at a family's doorstep. In the end, it was a combination of the footage and a slipper misplaced message between Ruby and someone at the Ford house that tightened the net. The saved footage showed a figure accessing the hotel feed and a later transfer that matched a time when the post had been uploaded. The messages revealed glee at the attention the rumor had generated. The kind of casual cruelty that looked defenseless in private, but vicious in public. The day the detective delivered the news that they had enough probable cause to charge someone with wrongdoing, the bakery felt like a fortress. Pearl had made a heavy bread that morning and kept it warm on the counter as if to ward off winter's chill. Stella sat at the small table and watched as a copy of the case file was placed beside her coffee cup. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked. His hand rested on her shoulder, the touch the same as on the day he first handed over a card. The familiarity of that gesture had gained new weight. "Sure not dead." Her chest had the tautness of someone who had been pulled into directions for too long. "I am," she said. "I am tired, but I'm okay." The charges were filed quietly, and when Ruby was asked to come in for a statement, she went with a face like a mask. Her lawyers advised caution, her family advised concern. The town advised everything in between. There were consequences. The legal system could deliver charges, potential fines, the stain of a public record. There were consequences. The court of public opinion would render more slowly, estrangement, the loss of friends who had once toasted her, the shunning that sometimes waits like a shadow. When the news finally ran, the headline was not the dramatic revenge many had hoped for. It was clinical, investigation underway into source of defamatory material. The article went on to detail the legal process. To avoid naming suspects until charges were formally pressed, people read it and considered. Some whispered triumphantly. Others shifted uncomfortably, feeling the truth of how easy it had been to believe a story that supported existing prejudices. For Stella, the moment of public vindication was less a fireworks display and more a slow thaw. She kept working in the bakery, the motion of kneading and folding becoming a meditation and a claim. Customers who had left with knives in their tongues now returned with cautious apologies. Some neighbors, who had once hungered for gossip, dropped in and spoke with apologies that tasted like bread palatable, though still a little flour-dusted. Ethan stood in a meeting with his board and made a statement about privacy and human dignity. He took responsibility for the parts of the situation that were his to own, not the actions of others, but his choices. He explained, plainly and without defensive flourish, why he had chosen not to disclose his status. "I wanted to meet Stella without preconceptions," he told them. "I wanted her to be known for herself. I misjudged the consequence. I failed to consider how secrecy would look like manipulation. That was wrong." The room that day had faces that balanced wary respect with questions about why he had thought deception was a method of decency. Ethan faced the discomfort. He apologized in public statements and in private conversations, and he made visible reparations. He endowed a small community fund to support victims of defamation. He initiated a roundtable on digital privacy at the county legal aid office, and he personally helped pay for legal fees that Stella and her allies had incurred. These acts did not erase the betrayal, but they were efforts that required vulnerability and expense. Stella watched his public mea culpa with a guarded curiosity. She wanted to be freed from the story, but she also wanted the man she had married to be accountable for his omissions. She wanted truth and transparency. He offered both words and actions that matched in a way she hadn't quite expected. "People want to make you a heroine," Pearl said one evening as they closed up shop, the two of them wiping down surfaces that still smelled faintly of sugar. "But you don't have to be a hero. You just have to be yourself, making the next loaf." Stella laughed, the sound raw and real. "I don't look heroic when the bread is burnt. You look human," Pearl replied. "That's better." Consequence came for Ruby in forms that were public and private. The legal process moved slower than anyone liked. A town court has its own rhythms. But the emotional consequences were immediate. Friends who once smiled with her began to avoid her calls. The cousin at the library, who had been complicit with a borrowed device, refused to meet her for coffee. Libby, who had egged the spectatorship on, faced strained dinners as others avoided the familial table. Humiliation can be reciprocal, but it is rarely equal. The law would weigh the evidence, and the town would measure the moral balance. In the meantime, Ruby found herself stripped of the applause she had so loved. The moment of official vindication for Stella arrived the way small towns deliver their big news, understated and earnest. The detective called a simple meeting at the precinct and explained, for the public record, that the footage had been manipulated, that malicious intent had been demonstrated, and that they would be pursuing charges. He said aloud what Stella had always known in her bones, that someone had weaponized her. There was no triumphant crowd. There were, instead, a dozen kind faces in the bakery the next morning and a local columnist who wrote a piece about how we treat our neighbors in the age of virality. We were too quick to like, the column read. We were too slow to ask the hard question, what is the cost of a cheap thrill? People left flowers at the bakery window, not as trophies, but as apologies. The discovery of truth did something else as well. It forced the town to look at Ethan honestly. If he had been lauded as a hero for buying the bakery and standing by her, he was also faced with the criticism of the concealment. The scrutiny did not automatically translate into distrust, it translated into conversation. Ethan answered questions with a clarity that grew each time he spoke. He told his side, not to justify but to explain. He spoke about wanting to meet Stella without the filters his status would bring, about a fear that anything he offered might be read as a purchase rather than a gift. He had misjudged the ethics of secrecy. Stella listened to those interviews with a complicated attention. There was gratitude for the ways he had defended her, for the flour-dusted hands that had learned to make a proper baguette. There was also a memory of every time she had felt excluded from a portion of his life. She had been angry enough to walk away, and then measured her anger against the months they had spent building something together in small, ordinary gestures. She weighed his apologies not by the words alone, but by how he sustained them. How he stepped into public discomfort, and how he continued to stand by the bakery when the cameras left. Rebuilding trust was not a movie montage. It was a series of small, accountable acts. Ethan began to include Stella in things she had been shielded from before. He sat beside her at client dinners when appropriate. He invited her to some of the board events she wanted to attend. He introduced her to people without fanfare and without wanting to control the narrative. He stopped speaking for her in public, and when he did express support, he made room for her voice to be heard. Stella, for her part, insisted on more than platitudes. She required honesty about finances when questions about how the bakery was funded arose. She asked for transparency about public statements. She demanded that apologies be followed by behavior. There were fights small, ferocious things born of insecurity and old fears, but the arguments had a different quality. They were about repair, not performance. Slowly, the town's narrative shifted from spectacle to curiosity to tolerance. People came for the bread and stayed for the way the place smelled like warmth. The bakery began to host a weekly evening class where Pearl taught traditional loaves and Stella taught modern pastries. The classes filled quickly with a mix of the curious and the contrite. The room became a place where stories were shared, not gossip, but recipes and lives. Katie filmed short clips of the classes and posted them with captions about resilience and the joy of learning to make something with your hands. One winter afternoon, a snow feathered the street, and the sign above the bakery caught little crystals on its edge. Ethan and Stella stood in the back room sifting flour. They had an easy silence between them, an economy that sometimes followed storms. The sun slid across the workbench and found the scar of a cut Stella had earned months ago, while reminding a delivery driver of proper stacking technique. It was a small, literal mark of work. "You kept the photograph I gave you," Ethan said suddenly. Stella looked up. He was holding a small, slightly bent photograph, the earliest loaf she'd made, the one with the proud cracked crust. The same she kept in her apron pocket on the first night he'd told her they had hope. "I did," she said. "Why?" He smiled, that small honest curve that had become rarer and therefore more precious. "Because it's a reminder." He placed the photo on the table and then took a breath. "I asked for forgiveness publicly. I tried to do right by acts that mattered. But this," he tapped the photograph, "is a reminder that your life is not a project, it's a life. I will never treat you like something to be fixed." Stella reached for his hand. The gesture felt like a closing of a circle and the opening of a new one. "I don't want to be fixed," she said. "I want partnership. I want honesty." He nodded. "Then let me earn that every day." It would take time. Trust is a fragile currency that requires daily deposits. There were setbacks, a headline that misread one of Ethan's business moves as a ply for PR. A neighbor who decided the bakery's success was somehow owed to an unfair advantage. But most days the simpler things prevailed. The bell over the door, the smell of cinnamon, a child's delighted face at a sugar cookie. The town, too, seemed to settle into the idea that there could be more than one truth, that people could be cruel and redeeming at once. The legal case against Ruby moved forward. She was charged with unlawful access to computer systems and defamation. The court hearing was public, and Stella attended with Pearl and Katie in the pew-like benches that lined the small municipal hall. Ruby sat with clenched jaw, her riding gloves off for the first time in months, as if to show vulnerability. In court, witnesses recounted the online trail. John's methodical reconstruction of the access logs helped build a case that even a jury could follow. When the judge read a sentence that included community, service, and restitution, small legal penalties that fit the degree of harm the room exhaled. For the first time in a long while, the narrative had a clear moral: actions have consequences. Ruby stood to leave, and some people in the room stared with something like triumph. But Stella felt nothing like celebratory glee. The months of humiliation had not been about courtroom justice alone. They had changed the shape of her life in ways that no sentence could fully repair. Outside the courthouse, a woman from the paper approached Stella with a softness that felt like reconciliation. "Are you going to keep the bakery?" she asked. It was a neutral question that felt enormous. "Yes," Stella said without hesitation. "It's mine now. Not because anyone bought it for me, but because I worked for it." Pearl did the rest. Pearl, nearby, puffed out her chest with a wise smile. "She's done more than bake a roll," Pearl said. "She's been brave." Months blurred into the slow return of ordinary rhythms. The bakery's calendar filled with weddings and school fundraisers, with people who needed lemon tarts for birthdays and the steady, unflashy business of life. Stella hired an assistant baker who loved dough the way she did. And Katie's social media presence became a quiet boon for small local businesses. John left the immediate orbit of Ethan's office for a different role, one that allowed him to set boundaries with the kinds of midnight investigations he'd become excellent at. He remained a friend. Ethan, too, rebalanced. The public scrutiny had recalibrated his priorities in ways that affected boardroom decisions, and allowed him to be both a leader and a partner. There were tentative reconnections with family. Libby called one afternoon and asked, in a small voice, if they could meet for tea. The conversation was stiff at first, like to people learning to speak the same language again, but there were gestures of goodwill. An invitation to a Christmas gathering where Stella would bring croissants. The Ford family, chastened by public reality, re-evaluated their choices in ways small and sincere. Not all bridges were mended. Not all apologies were offered. Some people never returned. That, too, was part of the reckoning. And then, in a moment that caught them both off guard, Stella found a new kind of fear and joy rising in her at once. She was late by a week, and then two. She took a test in the empty back room of the bakery, the white stick trembling in her fingers like a fragile hinge. When the 2 lines appeared, the breath left her like a released bell. She took the news to Pearl, who sat as if she'd been waiting. "About time," Pearl said, a slight reprimand softened by warmth. They told Ethan together in the quiet of the evening. He stood very still and then laughed, not a nervous laugh, but one shot through with wonder. He wrapped his arms around Stella as if to keep the moment contained and safe. The pregnancy was not a spectacle. They did not make an announcement to the town the way reality television dramatized such things. Instead, they retreated into the small intimacies that had become the foundation of their days, quiet breakfasts. The ritual of kneading dough together with one hand while the other rested on a belly that would soon hold new life. The pregnancy became a symbol not of ownership or of prettified redemption, but of a life continuing with hard-won tenderness. the months brought new rhythms. Stella's mornings were made gentler by a restful belief that the future could hold possibility. The bakery adjusted menus shortened in the third trimester. Volunteers signed up for early morning shifts, and regulars brought casseroles and well-worn copies of parenting books. The town, which had once been so quick to tear down, showed up in small mercies, casseroles, hand-sewn baby hats, a shower that was more about community than spectacle. In the softness of those days, Stella and Ethan built rituals that felt like scaffolding for trust. They had honest talks about boundaries and about the ways secrecy could warp even the kindest intentions. Ethan sometimes slept with the baby monitor by his bedside, listening to the quiet breathing of a future he had once tried to protect by omission. Stella learned, slowly and with deliberate will, to let him in without erasing the autonomy she had fought to reclaim. He learned to ask, to be transparent, and to accept that love is not only about dramatic gestures, but about the faithful hum of everyday presence. On a spring morning, when the bakery signs shone new paint and the town's trees loosened their buds, they held a small gathering for friends and family. No press, no headlines, only the people who had not left. Pearl read a short note about resilience and practical love. Katie filmed a clip that she shared later with the caption, "A town that learns sometimes saves more than a reputation." Ethan gave a concise, heartfelt speech about errors and repair. He did not ask to be absolved. He asked only to be counted among those committed to doing better. Stella spoke last. She stood in the doorway and let light fall on her face. She did not make a sermon. She simply told the truth about how fragile dignity is and how resilient people can be when they are handed back their names. She thanked those who had stayed and those who had returned. Then she looked at Ethan and said, quietly, "I trusted you once because you bought me a bakery. I choose to keep trusting you because you continue to choose me. That's different than fixing something for someone. That's being with someone." Ethan took her hand. He did not make promises bigger than he could keep. He said, simply, "I am with you." They had moved, in fragments and with great effort, from hate to love not, because hatred had been transformed into infatuation, but because the town's reflex to make a scapegoat had been replaced with something harder, accountability, repair, and the slow permitting of a person to live without being defined by a single ugly moment. The bakery stayed open through the day, the bell at the door ringing with a steady rhythm, customers coming and going like a small chorus of community. People bought bread and left with more than it, a taste of ordinary kindness that had weathered scandal and come through it without turning cruel. In the evening, Pearl and Stella sat at the back table, plates of brioche between them. The baby's small kick still faint, like a heartbeat that belonged to the future, tucked themselves into the conversation. Stella closed her eyes for a moment and let the words settle inside her. Survival. Not dramatic vindication, nor a clean victory. Just survival and work and love that showed up every day. Outside, the streetlight threw a long pool of gold across the pavement. A couple crossed holding hands. A dog barked and then lay down in the snow. The town that had once hurled a rumor into the air and watched it bloom into a storm now had a new story, one less flashy, less hungry for ruin, and perhaps, in its own small way, more faithful to the truth that people are made and remade by the gestures of care, by apology, and by steadfast presence. As they closed up for the night, Stella touched the photograph she had kept in her apron pocket, the one of her first loaf. She slid it into Ethan's palm for a moment. He looked at it and then at her, and the expression on his face was not triumph, but gratitude that a life could be rebuilt, without erasing the person who had always been at its center. They stepped out into the evening together, no longer only at war with the town or their own doubts. There was no dramatic finale, no last-minute reversal. There was, instead, the slow rhythm of lives continued, a bakery to run, a child to welcome, a community to reshape. The question posed at the beginning from hate to love did not find a tidy answer. It found, instead, a living proof that love, when earned by honesty and repair and daily presence, can indeed change the arc of a life. If you were moved by Stella's story of resilience and rebuilding, subscribe to hear more stories of transformation and hope.